Part 1. Jogos e Geneches. Jogos de Canas is an equestrian game in which multiple quadrilles of horsemen throw light reels at each other. The game can be traced back to the North African game of Jared. Also to be noted, the Nasrid dynasties had a long fascination with equestrian games in Granada. Now, Jared was pretty much identical to Jogo de Canas, where each side has jarrets, also known as wooden staffs, and try to hit the other parties with the sticks. Now, Granada was originally founded by the Moors in 711, not to be confused with the store, though that's a good way to memorize it, after the Umayyad conquest of Hispania, where large parts of the Iberian Peninsula was conquered. Present-day Granada was founded in the 11th century during a civil war that ended the Caliphate. Now, going back to Jogos de Canas, the game was recognized as Moorish in all intents and purposes, yet was embraced as an okay thing for Spanish nobles as well. Pretty much an Iberian version of the joust. Secondly, instead of the mock combats between Christians and Moors, the Canas were different in that all participants dressed in Moorish style. One of the article of clothing that each side had to wear was I'm going to mess this up, but Morlata. You can just look at the screen. But it was basically a Moorish cloak. Now, it's hard to dismiss the game as Christian superiority over Islam, since the game was played only by Spaniards in Moorish clothing. And to go even further, the game in many cases were played to wild foreigners. And lastly, the Canas were not only a spectacle, but also a habitual practice that helped with horsemanship. A certain style of riding was called the La Gineta, where shortened stirrups and much higher seat was implemented as opposed to the Norman bridle. With the shorter stirrups, the rider could use his knees as well as his heels to guide the horse through tricky maneuvers, pretty much helping them in the game, Canas. The Janeta was associated with a style that emulated the Moorish horsemanship. Later, the Janeta style of horsemanship became the Spanish bridle. The Janeta style slowly decays, though, with the process of Europeanization, as well as the declining aspect of chivalry. Also, Luis de Banelos detailed an account in Libro de la Janeta y Descadencia de los Cabellos Casemes. I'm sorry, I probably read that wrong, but yeah, you can just look at the screen. But basically, he blames the America's huge influx in gold, turning the affections of the Spanish ladies. So pretty much he was saying that the Spanish ladies became gold diggers, and that the man knownness stopped focusing on looking good on the horse and instead went for the Benjamins. Now, a good point to mention is that nowhere it was mentioned that style was rejected because of the Moorish origins. Now, as I stated earlier, the Canas was seen as both a performance and military training. So, to no surprise, Philip II included the Canas among the military exercises being implemented for the Spanish to use to get ready for war. With the Canas being played by the nobles and for military exercise, it eventually became an essential component of Spanish aristocratic celebrations, such as greeting foreign royalty as well as celebrating royal births. One of the main appeals for the foreign royals and observers were the exotic attire of the contestants, such as the Moorish embroidery and head wraps that were donned. Now, even with the sound evidence linking Jogo de Canas to Moorish and North African influence, there were still people who argued against this. One of these people were Don Fernando, Don Pedro's interlocutor. You can look at the board for that word. Fernando tried to prove that the Jogo de Canos tradition came from Roman Troy, being practiced by young boys. He agrees, though, on the quality of the games as well as its martial prowess, trying to tie the spectacle back to the Roman and imperial past, as both contested as well as shared between the European nations, was still futile, because trying to classicize it, it never fully obscured the Moorish origins of the Kanas. But as the practice became established within Spain, any sense of Moorish impersonation most likely disappeared. They were the Moors during the spectacles. The striking question that many ask is why Spain is still presenting itself in Moorish guise so late. I, for one, see it in a similar fashion of like the Native Americans in America, how they were being portrayed in the cinema and other media during the early time period. First, the Native Americans, they were depicted as savage evildoers, but later on, us Americans began portraying them in a not so negative light. And now we got Twilight, where actual Native Americans are being presented as themselves. To end, the Spaniards fully embodied playing the Moor during the spectacles, with their own bodies, no exaggeration or deformation like you would think, especially considering Americans' perceptions of stereotyped groups in the past. The Knights in Granada, Part 2. The idealized Moor at this time was often portrayed as a death jinete, or a participant in canas and other equestrian games. Perez de Hitas novel, I'm sorry, but I'm going to mess this up. Guerreras Civiles de Granada paints in detail the celebrations of the last years of the Nostrid court. The novel also recounted the struggles that led to the fall of Granada. Though the book focused on the scandalous love affairs of the Granadan aristocrats, which pretty much took over the accounts of the Granada in its fall. But it still did good on sales, and went through about 40 editions in Spain and Iberia alone, not even including the translations for the French, German, and English later on. Paris de Hita idealized the Moors in the same way as the Christian knights, even though they were still viewed as negative political examples. Now, what Spanish readers got from this novel was that there was a shared Iberian equestrian culture, whereas for foreigners, like I guess the English, for example, the literary depictions of the Moors could or would not be a familiarity. So pretty much they felt that it was foreign. So kind of helped them contribute to their exoticization, if that's the word, exoticization of Spain, and help them distinguish themselves between them. Now, the games and celebrations being presented in Paris de Hita's novel brought together Moors and Christians at several levels. First, he suggests that there's a material connection creating the imaginative bond. Secondly, the fanciful elements of the Granadan games were Renaissance constructions in portraying the Moors, as well as emphasis on the horsemanship and elaborate attire also being reflected on the Moors and as chivalric pageantry. Sadly, though, the Guerras Civiles had an abrupt ending, which revealed through the pressures on the text. Barbara Fuchs suggests, though, that for Spaniards as well as for other Europeans, Moorishness remains as an ongoing dimension of Spain's identity long after the fall of Granada. Black Spain. Now, Spain's enemies abroad exploited its Moorish past for their own benefit. They tried to construct Spain as a religious as well as a separate racial other. Spain's enemies may surprise you though, because the ones exploiting Spain as a Moor land were in fact Italy, France, the Netherlands, and England. Now, you probably noticed that these countries are in fact European, Western Europe to be exact, and the reasons behind it was to challenge Spain's imperial dominance. Now, though Spain attempted at this time to distance itself from this heritage, the foreign accounts of admiration from its past, such as Granada and Spanish local color, gradually allowed for a new discourse of Moorishness. And the anti-Spanish propaganda at the time, Spain was almost always associated with Islam in Africa, pretty much saying darker skinned people. The black legend, so to speak, had two different meanings coming from the term. Metaphorically speaking, you can read that it stands for Spain's greed and cruelty in their Americas. Yet, the other meaning you can get from the black legend is that it refers to Spain's unambiguous racial difference. In a literal sense, it was an attempt to say Spain is black, not just visually, but biologically as well. Now, these characteristics, though, being portrayed against Spain, were very deliberate, and they were there to misrepresent the realization of Spain, pretty much. Now, racism on physicality did exist during this time period, singling out people based on their skin tone, but Moors, they weren't always that easy to pigeonhole. In Spain, during the 16th century, the way they saw race was different, and that Moors came in all skin tones, from tawny, brown skin, from black skin, and even white skin. Now, some texts in the moral file text even presented some Moorish women as blonde. L.P. Harvey ends up saying, and I quote, "It is likely that whatever differences might be visible at the level of individuals, at the level of the population as a whole, they were insignificant." The Spaniards at the time were not in a consensus, not in a consensus at all for where the Moors had come from. You had many attributing them to African origins, yet on the other hand, you had sympathizers who felt that they were in fact Spanish themselves, since they were born and raised there for almost 900 years. Now, the development of ethnic studies, as well as the culture of the U.S., bordering Central and South America, as well as the Caribbean, has helped to bring the Hispanic world out. The suspicion of Hispanic culture in America today may not be because of the growing number of Spanish-speaking people in the country, but it could stem from the much longer history of Spain, excluded from Europe as an exotic Moorish nation. Now, on the positive side, there was a lot of information. There was a lot of notes and sources showing that she actually did her research. And I think she gave a pretty good and biased view. Now, on the negative side, though, there was a lot of information. There were no pictures. And I think you would probably need to know Spanish to understand a lot of these words. Though translations of the words are there. So I guess it isn't too bad. This article will help readers understand what it was like playing a Moor during this time. And it will also help to understand Spain's ethnic issues with western parts of Europe and the reasons behind it. Overall, it was a pretty good read if you have the time and if you don't have to worry about Portuguese quizzes and tests that same day. Hope you all enjoyed. Bye.